Bore da pawb. Good morning, everyone. Croeso and welcome to Leading for Innovation. Really appreciate you sharing your time with us today and investing in what is set out to be a very thought-provoking session. There are going to be a number of questions that we're going to pose to you as we move across this session. A couple of those being, is your organization innovation ready? How can you limit the negative effects of busyness? Do you have authentic conversations as a leader? So you can expect inspiration, challenge, and some reflection from this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping bits and bobs for you before we get started. We're going to be recording the keynote element of this session to be able to share this with our community, and I'll explain the community in just a minute. What we won't be doing is recording any of the breakout sessions. So in terms of the structure for today, Carla and Rick, who I will introduce in a minute, have worked really hard on a number of ways to keep us as participants engaged in the session. So you've seen the poll, which many of you have answered, and thank you for that. So there will be a number of digital ways for you to engage in the session. We have offered a breakout, a 20-minute breakout for you to be able to talk to other individuals on the call and to share some of your reflections on the provocations which Rick will offer us. We encourage you to use the chat function to pose any questions, which we will collate and share with Rick at key points. And I think just the last point to give you some context. So the Changemakers Network, which you will have seen as part of the recruitment for this, comes from two innovative programs, two networks created from innovative programs. And I can see names that are engaged in both. So Innovative Future Services, or INFUSE, an innovation and research program focused on building the skills, capacity, and confidence for innovation. And then secondly, the Local Wealth Building Challenge Fund, working on some really innovative solutions for some of the biggest problems facing our region and wider. What I'm going to do is introduce our colleague, Professor Rick Delbridge, who is a professor of organizational analysis and a co-convener of the Centre for Innovation Policy and Research at Cardiff University. And before you start, Rick, I just wanted to mention that this is one, and we're very pleased to have Rick, who I think is incredible in this space. This is one of our offers to you as innovators. So we've got some follow-up events. The next one, which is entitled Bring Me Problems, Not Solutions. So we have Ken Perry and Nina Ruddle joining us to look at a critical kind of analysis of systems leadership in this space. And the second, we have an in-person event on the 26th of October, which will have a huge focus on data innovation and the way that we can unlock the power of data to move us forward. And if Rick does an incredible job today, and you would value it, we would like to offer you a follow-up session, and we'll run a poll on this later for us to dig into some of your reflections in a more detailed manner. But that's enough from me. Rick, over to you.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, colleagues, for joining us, and thanks to Carla for all the hard work behind the scenes. Yeah, as Owen said, we're interested in whether you would find value in a follow-up session, but we're not going to ask you to commit to that before you've had this morning's. You might decide you've heard quite enough from me by then. Pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today about leading for innovation. And I was going to make a couple of points early on about what I'll do and how I'll do it and how I suggest you might think about engaging with what I'll say. So First off, I've spent many more years than I care to remember now researching aspects of innovation, the organisation of innovation, the management of innovation, leadership for innovation, but I'm not a consultant. And I'm not here for a moment to pretend I know more about your organisation than you do. But what I can bring is that range of different perspectives from myself and others who've looked at these issues over many years and in different contexts. So what I would say is listen and interpret for yourselves what might be useful, if anything, of what I say and how that might be relevant to your organisation. And if something doesn't resonate with you, if it doesn't sort of hit home for you, then don't worry about it. Park it. It may come back to you later that it was relevant. It may not be relevant to your particular experience. And the second thing I'd say is take the opportunity to pop questions in the chat or to raise your hand and ask a question. And do take the opportunity in the breakout groups to listen to each other, because you guys have got, in a way, the sort of invaluable shared experience of trying to do some of these things on the ground. And I'm a firm believer that we can learn a lot from each other who have similar challenges, are seeking to unearth similar opportunities. And so that's why we've tried to create some space in the programme for that sort of discussion amongst yourselves. Okay, so without further ado, let me pop up some slides. They're coming through. Hopefully people can see those okay. If you can't see those, shout out, otherwise I'll assume we're okay. So let's run through what I'm going to talk about this morning in a little bit of detail. I want to just be clear on what we mean by innovation first, because it is a term that's used very widely and quite inconsistently. Then I'm going to touch on the role of individuals, including leaders, but also what we might term middle managers, people in the middle of the organisation with perhaps some management responsibility, but also with direct report responsibilities, and look at how they can contribute to processes of innovation. And I'm going to talk about innovation as a process. And I'm going to talk about that process at three levels of activity: your own, your personal way of thinking and doing the job that you have, the interactions you might have with other individuals or small groups, this notion of the conversation, the purposeful conversation I'll touch on, and then we'll move to the organisational setting. And for those of you who had the opportunity, we circulated a short innovation fitness test questionnaire that I've taken from a good friend and colleague of mine, John Bessant's website. I'll share the link to that later. And I think that raises a series of interesting questions about the different aspects of organisation that are potentially influential on how innovation processes take place and the outcomes of those processes. And working through those three levels, I want to encourage you to reflect on how there are things that can be done at each of those levels and the way in which those three levels interface and potentially interact. Okay, and I'm going to try and cover that in around 30 to 40 minutes to allow us time to have the breakout groups where you'll no doubt talk about whatever you fancy talking about, but we'll give you a couple of ideas for things to reflect on, and then we'll bring the group back together to hear a little bit about your reflections on your own results from completing the fitness test survey and other thoughts on what you've heard. But crucially, as Owen said at the beginning, what we're hoping to do, what we're trying to do with these sessions is sort of challenge and inspire you to think about something that you might go and do differently, go and do better, go and do with greater enthusiasm and energy that'll take you and your organisation in the direction that you think is most appropriate. So first off and quickly, what do we mean by innovation? Well, there are multiple definitions: creating value from ideas, creating value from doing something new or different. I think the important aspects of the definition is that it's a process. There's a verb, creating. It's about value, but I think it's important for us, particularly working in the public sector or third sector, to remember that it's not just economic value that we're talking about when we talk about innovation. It could be cultural, social, public value. Indeed, my own business school has set out a strategy around public value, which looks at how our research, our teaching, our engagement, civic engagement can bring value to society, as well as generate the sorts of returns that the university expects from its school. So it's about doing things that are new or different. And I think that's also important. It's not necessarily being the first organisation ever to have done X, Y, or Z, or ever to have produced A, B, or C. If it's new to you, new to your organisation, and you're adapting and developing ideas from elsewhere, but creating value through those by doing something new or different, that for me is just as significant. And in fact, most innovative activity is of that kind of incremental and somewhat derivative form. So I think we need to be inclusive in understanding innovation, but also set some understanding of what's in our space for today, at least. Now, anybody recognise this gentleman? Bit early for quizzes, I know. Right, this is Thomas Edison. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard of Thomas Edison, American innovator, prolific inventor, multiple innovations around light bulbs, phonographs, cameras, telegraph, telephony, a very well-known figure. And he's an example of what often people think of as innovators, an individual person, probably with an enormous brain, who's bringing their intellect, perhaps with a eureka moment, to bear on a problem or an issue. And there's some truth in that. Edison was clearly an estimable character, but research in what Edison did and how he did it, I think, gives us a much more useful insight into the process of innovation. I see somebody popped a question into the chat there. Let's say that the research on what Edison actually did shows how it was his capacity to convene other excellent minds and organize these in his research laboratory that has been described as his major innovation. It was actually to head up and establish this R&D activity that involved many people, that allowed him to produce the level of patents and inventions that he's credited with. He took much of the credit and most of the cash, but it was what we would recognise as a collective endeavour. And some of the research that shed light on what Edison did and how he did it was conducted by a guy who I've got to know quite well, who works in California, Andy Hargaden, who's written a book on Edison's research lab. And I noticed that he'd done a little piece comparing Edison with Steve Jobs from Apple. And I thought this was useful. If we're thinking about what role individuals play, then it's interesting that Andy's compared Jobs and Edison in this way. Both effectively harnessed and connected the efforts of small groups of extremely smart, extremely creative people. So it's that convening, that leading, that engaging at a team level, which is why you'll sometimes see people referring to innovation as a team sport. That is the basis upon which I want to engage in the conversation today. So it's not about individual heroic leaders, it's about groups, processes, and the wider organisation and how those components fit together. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to refer to some work that appears in a couple of the chapters of a book that I was involved in writing quite a few years ago now, called The Exceptional Manager. And this was one of the outputs that was produced by something called the Advanced Institute of Management Research, which was a bringing together of a number of leading academic researchers across business schools in the UK to address issues around management practices, innovation, and productivity. And we pooled our expertise and experience to write this book, and different members of the institute led on different chapters. The two chapters I'm going to talk about today weren't ones that I led on personally, although I led on bringing the whole of the content together. Now, why the title Exceptional Manager? Well, we wanted to flag that actually a lot of the time managers aren't making much difference at all. They're embedded in organizational structures which create a lot of inertia, a lot of routine, and it's often very difficult to be exceptional, to be a difference maker. So we wanted to establish that initially and then begin to think about how and where those differences can be made in the organization. So many what people sometimes describe as airport lounge books on management, you'll see that leadership, strategy, individual charismatic leaders are highlighted. There's often a lot of emphasis on particular strategies or ways of undertaking the organizational's activities. But less often is it recognized that it's not just about top management and high level strategy that explains the success of organizations. And so we wanted to put something of a spotlight on what you might term middle managers, people embedded at reasonably senior levels in the organization, perhaps, but not people at the very top of the organization. And I would expect many of you recognize that as your role. You have some people that you're helping, guiding, leading, managing, and you have people that you're reporting to. And those roles are crucial in bridging between the senior management and the people that often do a lot of the doing and the responding to the challenges that the organization faces. So we wanted to explore some of what gets in the way of those people being able to make a difference and begin to unearth some of the ways in which they might be able to do things differently that would help them to achieve their own goals, because individuals in organizations will have their own objectives, their own priorities, but also how they can engage in ways that help deliver to the organization's agenda as well. Before I move on to talk about that in a little bit more detail, I also found this piece of work in Harvard Business Review from a few years ago, which I think is quite interesting. And I'll say a little bit more about this right at the very end. This is a study done by Linda Hill and colleagues. And as they said, there's been a lot of research on the role of leaders. And there's been quite a lot of research on innovation per se. But what they were particularly interested in was the role of the leader in creating a more innovative organization. And I thought this was interesting because this very much complements the ideas that I'm going to present to you. And it's very much consistent with the innovation fitness test rationale that we shared in advance. So Hill and colleagues point out in the initial intro to their article that it's through creating a community that is both willing and able to innovate that leaders can be successful in encouraging innovative organisation. And they go on to add that to be willing, the community, the people in the organisation must share a sense of purpose, values and rules of engagement. So it's about that interaction at the dyadic, the group level, but it's also about the individual's sense of purpose and values and how they go about their work. And to be able, companies must be able to generate ideas through discussion, discourse and debate. They need to be able to reflect on, respond, experiment and adjust on the basis of those ideas, and then be able to find ways of assimilating the new into the everyday normal. And that can involve handling a variety of different ideas and even opposing ideas and thinking through how those ideas can be put into practice. And so that, I think, is a neat segue for me to move into this section where I look at these three levels. But notice, please, that as we talk about the individual, we're looking to embed the individual, their orientations to action, their understanding of the context they work in that organizational setting, because innovation takes place in organizational arrangements. So I'm going to go through these three levels. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about busyness and how being busy, too busy, produces what we called in the book traps of non-action. We're too busy to do the things we should be doing because we're busy with other things, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Then I'll come on to this type of the nature of conversation, the types of conversations that take place, and then we'll move to the discussion around the innovation fitness test. Okay. So first, what are examples of the traps of non-action? And I'd be interested to know whether people recognise these in their own experiences. Okay. So first, the trap of overwhelming demands. Managers are caught in webs of expectations that can be overwhelming. The demands of day-to-day work leave no time for reflection, prioritisation. You're scrambling to stand still, and as a result, managers can often lose sight of what really matters. They spin the wheels and achieve little of significance. So you feel as though you've been really busy, but actually you've got very little to show for it. A second trap of non-action can be where managers feel as though they've got too many rules and regulations imposed upon them, leaving them with little to no space for autonomous action. The ability to focus on the factors that, oh, your polls come in the way of my slides, Carla, there we are. We're just going to ask you about whether these make any meaning, have any meaning for you. The rules that people feel they're subject to can actually be experienced as limiting their ability to act. And that means they can then either find themselves rather blindly following those rules without reflecting on whether they're leading them to do the appropriate things, or it can undermine their sense of capacity to think outside of those rules. And innovation and the ability to harness new ideas often requires some ability and some reflection that takes us beyond the routine, the normal, the expected. And then thirdly, a trap of unexplored choices, and you can see that these link together in a certain way, and that's where a focus on the demands and constraints of the day job can produce tunnel vision. So people tend to be very focused on the immediate, the requirements that they can see in front of them, and may fail to perceive the opportunity to make different choices and to explore alternative opportunities. So you can see these three related traps of non-action can produce something lacking in terms of innovativeness and creative thinking. So what might be some of the ways of trying to overcome these challenges? Now, as I said at the outset, I don't want to suggest that there's a magic wand or a silver bullet in what I'm saying here, but what I'm hoping is that on the basis of a lot of rigorous research in many different organizational settings that allowed us to distill these different ways in which individuals have addressed some of these challenges, there might be something here that gets you thinking that might be useful. So taking the trap of overwhelming demands, and I'm going to go into an example of each of these in more detail. The The research suggests that it can be helpful to develop your own explicit personal agenda, recognizing what you want to be working towards personally within the organizational setting, trying to slow down and reduce the number of priorities that you're facing and the competing demands that your day job contains. Structure the amount of time you spend with other people so that you create the space for reflection, and explore the degree to which you can begin to manage your organizations, your boss's expectations, and influence some of what they're expecting of you. And I've seen somebody, I can't follow all of the chat because they pop up quite quickly, but yes, we can share the slides. The slides have, for example, the slides have a web link to the book that I've mentioned, and that's a freely accessible PDF, so you can follow up on. There is a lot of content here. I'm just trying to sort of, you know, introduce you to some of these ideas. The ones that look most relevant to you, then hopefully you'll be able to find the time, avoid the trap of non-action, and follow up with those later. Unbearable constraints. First, begin by mapping out what you think those constraints are, determining maybe whether some of them are more significant than others, and prioritize where you're going to put your efforts. Accept that there'll be trade-offs, and recognize you may need, on occasion, to work outside of the expectations of the organization to get to where the organization actually wants you to get. And that can mean being comfortable with a certain degree of ambiguity or conflict about the different expectations that you have. While we talk in abstract terms about how organizations should be rationally organized to be machine-like in the way that they're set up to deliver on their objectives, we all know from our experiences of working in organizations is that that's not how organizations are in practice, partly because it's not realistic in complex organizational settings that are facing multiple competing demands for themselves. And then the third area around unexplored choices, a bit like mapping constraints. Initially, just think about the choices that you're making. Be reflective around how you're facing these competing demands and therefore having to make choices. Think about the choices you're taking without actually noticing, because that might unearth alternative ways of doing things. You may want to develop your own experience or involve conversations with other key actors to think about alternative ways of doing things, and then try and find the space to enjoy some opportunity to act outside of the constraints that you're currently experiencing. Okay. So I've run through these a little. This is the sort of content that you'll find in the chapter of the book. So when you talk about developing an explicit agenda, this is very much about you and what you're trying to achieve personally. So the evidence suggests that effective action takers build a precise idea of what they want to achieve in their jobs. What are your personal priorities, and how well do they map onto the current way you're doing your job and the expectations that your organization have of you. Mapping the constraints, develop a clear map initially, and then which ones are the cause killers, which ones are really obstacles to delivering on what your role is or should be, and which ones don't matter that much, which ones might be bigger in your mind than they are in practice. Focus on the former, don't get too distracted by the latter. And then the choices that you're making, are you aware of those in the first instance? Have you explored alternative ways of doing things? And can you expand what those potential alternatives might be by either developing your own experiences and skills or by building relationships with others? So possibilities of finding other ways of doing things that allow you to have that more focused, purposeful engagement on a day-to-day basis. Okay. Let's move to this next level, the interactional level. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about types of conversation. Conversations that are emotionally authentic, conversations maybe more rational or rigorous in their nature. And as any good social scientist, if you take two variables, you can produce a 2x2 matrix. Okay, I'll show that in a moment. But if we've agreed that collaboration and relationships, teamwork are crucial to innovation, then we need to turn our attention to the nature and content of these relationships. It's not just having a relationship, it's what's the quality of that relationship. And as my good friend and colleague Kevin Morgan always says, trust is a particularly unusual asset. It has value, but no price. You can't buy trust. It's developed through interactions, through conversations that are authentic. And so research has shown the importance of these reflective, purposeful conversations. And in the book, we talk a bit about how individuals in companies have developed new ideas, shared knowledge and experiences, and enhanced their capacity to learn and their organization's collective capacity to learn through different types of purposeful conversation. And conversely, we find that in many organizations, these conversations can be rather thin and ritualized. And you all, I'm sure, sat in meetings that have had no direction, no real apparent purpose. The return on the time investment has been approaching zero. That's probably because they fail to have either analytically rigorous content or any emotional authenticity in the engagement. So these going through the motions set pieces aren't particularly helpful to us. What we want to do is explore ways in which we can produce more purposeful and valuable interactions. And so through use of the 2x2, you can see low rationality, low rigor, low authenticity. These are ritualized talk meetings that have no great purpose or direction. And we want to contrast those with three other types of conversation that might each be more valuable, where there's a high degree of rigor, but it may not be that there's a great deal of emotional engagement. You might describe these as disciplined debate. Creative dialogue combines that rigor and that emotional authenticity. And intimate exchanges are more about building the personal relationships. So there's a higher level of emotional authenticity, much less emphasis on rigor. This is about building trust and empathy. And those underpinning social relations are often crucial in innovative processes. So in disciplined debate, you might have conversations that challenge the assumptions behind certain proposals or explore what data or evidence might be needed to prove these. So they're high on rigor. It's much less about the personal and the emotional in those types of conversation. Creative dialogue is in part, and this builds on that point about the trap of non-action. It's about creating the time and space to be able to share ideas and take risks in ways that are informed, analytically and rigorous, but build upon and help develop more personal relationships. In the academic world, in universities, there's been increasing interest in interdisciplinary research and increasing recognition that research within academic silos of engineering or bioscience or management studies, there's a lot of drilling down, but not enough connecting across to address some of the world's major pressing societal challenges, be that around inequality, sustainability, and so on. And being able to build the nature of social relations that allows that cross-disciplinary communication takes time, build trust, build a sense of shared understanding and language, which is why really radically innovative activity takes these social relations so that people from different knowledge bases can come together. And I'm sure you can think in your own organizations where you might have different specialists who can communicate with each other, but often are at a loss to understand what another group of specialists are talking about. And it's sometimes about creating the space and time to build the relationships and build that shared understanding that can help new and different things be put into practice. And then the final box here, as I've said, perhaps in some ways the underpinning for the kind of creative dialogue I've been describing. Some of the managers we looked at that were particularly successful in contributing to the innovativeness of their organisation were those who'd given time and attention to the sorts of more personal conversations that others might look at as something of a waste of time. They took the time to have these authentic conversations with others to begin to build a more personal relationship. And that involves giving of yourself as well. It means being yourself, so there's high levels of authenticity and moving beyond perhaps the content of more transactional business-based relations and interactions. And that they're important, and they can then be established and exist as valuable resources for interaction over extended periods of time. Okay, so I'll move now to the third area, the organisational, and we're moving towards the time when we'll be able to take the breakout group, and you guys can have a think about what we've been discussing so far, and also reflect on the fitness test survey that at least some of you, I hope, have had a chance to take a look at. So we've talked about individuals and the quality of the relationships that you develop with your colleagues, and they can provide a strong basis for innovation. But without a conducive organisational context, and that organisational context may be constituted by structure, strategy, process, what often people collapse into a catch-all of culture of the organisation is going to be absolutely crucial. And I think that the innovation fitness test is a useful, simple exercise to get people to think about how well their organisation might be positioned to be able to be innovative in the ways it currently does things. And of course, while you can't equate exactly the experiences of individuals and organisations, organisations can fall into some of the same traps that we've talked about individuals struggling with. Organisations can fail to recognise that the world around them has changed and what they're geared up to do needs to change. They can be very heavily path dependent on what they've done previously as the way that things always should be done. And so they're the sorts of things that can be impediments to being innovative, being more reflective and responsive. So that's the sorts of questions that John Besson's fitness test gets you to think about. So having looked at the survey and had a think about your organisation, what you want you to look at in the breakout groups is where there are things that might have surprised you, where there are things that you might want to change, and how could you as an individual begin to contribute to the making of that change. Okay, so for those of you who didn't have the chance to have a look at the innovation fitness test, hopefully you have it with you and you might take some opportunity in the breakout group to have a look at it. But to give you a flavour, it gives you these questions, and again, as I said, this is the source you can find it from subsequently. It gives you certain questions that you score on a note, that's not how we do things at all around here, through to yeah, that's exactly how this organisation works. Okay, and I think there are 40 questions, and there are 8 per section of 5, and you can then collate your score for each of the different sections. One refers, broadly speaking, to strategy, then processes, then the organisation, its linkages. That's something I haven't got time to talk about today. But the organisations are not isolated entities. Innovation is often about the linkages you form beyond your own organisation. and the capacity to learn within the organisation. And if you complete the survey in that way, you're able to then produce a profile of where your organisation maybe has certain strengths or certain weaknesses across those five dimensions. So an encouraging number of you have said that you had a chance to look at the survey. Thank you for that. And that will make the next 20 minutes or so, I think, more valuable for you. As I said before, do take the opportunity to chat to each other about what your experiences are, because we often find that people can think, not copy what others have done, but think about how what's worked well in one place might provide insights into the ways that things could be successfully done differently in your organisation. So we're going to move to the breakout groups now. Carla's going to wave her magic wand, hopefully. And we'll set aside about 20 minutes for this, I think, Owen, Carla. So you'll be allocated into rooms, and then we'll bring you back in. And then we're going to, for the last period, it will be about 25 minutes or so. We'll run through a discussion organised around these questions. So to the extent that you bring some structure to the conversation you have over the next 20 minutes or so, these are the sorts of things we'd like to hear from you when you return to them. We're interested in whether any of you would value a further opportunity to discuss these issues. We haven't got a view on what form that might take, but we'd certainly be interested in taking a look at the fitness survey results that you've gathered. You know, we wouldn't release them to anybody. We would anonymize them and take them in aggregate form, but it'd be interesting for us to see how that paints a picture of the situation that you find yourselves in. And if it would be helpful to have a follow-up session, then Owen and myself, Carla, can think about what that might look like. If you have views on that, then please share them. And then I was just going to show you, just because you haven't had enough to think about already, I was just going to show you some of the questions that have informed the HBR article. And there are two sorts of questions here. They're questions about the organisation. So they're very much complementary to the sorts of survey questions that you've done for the fitness test. But these last few questions are much more about yourselves as individuals, how you think about your own job and your own role in your organisation. And so it might be, so again, these will be on the slides that we share. The reference to the article is also available. That's available online. So it might be interesting to think about putting yourselves back into that organisational context. Anyway, we're running short of time. Owen, I'm going to hand over to you for a reminder on the upcoming sessions and anything else that needs to be said. Thanks very much, colleagues, for your participation and your attention. Really appreciate it. And if we can help further, we hope to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and to Carla, working incredibly hard in the background to keep us engaged and in the right place. Rick, I think the poll answered your question. I think we'll welcome you back. And possibly give you a couple of headaches.
They didn't commit to having a follow-up session with me, Owen. Just a follow-up session with somebody else. You might have had a different answer.
Just to conclude, again, really appreciate you investing your time in this. To Amy's question in the chat, yes, we are still accepting applications to Infuse. So you will have a follow-up email with Rick's slides, with an invitation to sign up to the next session, which is that Bring Me Problems, Not Solutions, absolutely linked to what Rick has delivered today. The Changemakers in-person event on the 26th of November, and also a link to what we are doing around that very specific innovation program on the transition to net zero in terms of public transportation at the moment. But thank you very much, and I hope to see you all again soon. Appreciate your investment. Diolch.